Hey, Sam, welcome to the Virtual CMO podcast. So glad you could join us today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
I'm always excited about a guest who covers a topic that we really haven't explored before. And that was one of the reasons I was excited to connect with you and have you on the show today, because we're going to get into some things that we really haven't gone into detail before on. And I think it's something that could be a real benefit to business owners. So as we get into it, I hope the audience finds the same. If we could just start out a little bit, give us a little bit of your background and how you got into the marketing and content creation space.
Sure. Well, I spent the bulk of my career at Publicis creative agency in New York, and was lucky enough to work with really big global brands that were on their roster: Walmart, various P&G brands, Citibank, etc. And while I was there, I kind of found myself into their what you might call an insights department. It was comprised of data scientists, SEO people, and I managed a two-person behavioral science team. And the gist of the work really revolved around using surveys to answer questions about shoppers and
Hmm.
what they preferred, what they liked, etc., and in order to inform the strategy and creative work. So that was maybe, let's see, 5 or 6 years. And then in the spring of 2020, COVID comes online, and I'll skip over all the day by day of what happened. But by that fall, I kind of decided to take a shot at being going independent full time and starting my own service, and have really spent um, all the time since there trying to really nail down my own positioning or product market fit. And we can certainly get into that topic. But anyways, right now, as it stands, I'm using my background in strategy and creative and survey-based research to help small and medium-sized businesses answer questions about their shoppers, namely how they might react to a value proposition, how they might react to a benefit claim, how they react to a brand's positioning. And I think there's kind of a gap between a DIY approach, which would take the form of a Google Forms or a Survey Monkey, and engaging a marketing agency, which would be quite a bit more expensive. So I'm kind of in between a medium cost insight solution that's quicker, and kind of cuts to the chase of what I think a brand really wants to know, which is, what the hell do our shoppers think our key message is, and is it
Yes.
working? We can also get into this, but a few smart surveying questions can go a long way. And I'm definitely not in the business of making and selling a gigantic questionnaire and charging $100,000 and handing over a 100-slide deck that will be mostly ignored. So yeah, that's the background and a snapshot of what's happening in the present. And I maybe one other thing worth mentioning there is the shift from working from Walmart to small and medium-sized brands is fantastic. It's
Yeah.
the shift from working with a brand manager to a founder that you end up cheering for, and you do anything to help and really appreciate how damn hard it is to actually start a successful business. But
Yes.
it's just a huge net positive. So I'm happy with that decision, and that I made about 2 years ago. Um, and yeah, hope to keep it going.
Well, that's great. I mean, you there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm anxious to get into the discussion. So, I think first of all, what I'd like to talk about is this whole idea of the power of words and what companies articulate as their value proposition, those benefits that you talk about. Typically, when you engage with a company, have they done any real research to see if the words that they're using, the way that they're sort of framing their value proposition, is there any science behind it, or generally is it they just get together in a room, whiteboard some ideas, and that's what ends up being on their website?
It It's a good question. In my experience, it's a little bit of both. And
Mm.
just to be clear about the type of client or brand that I'm working with, or that you should have in mind, imagine a brand that's anywhere between making a few million in revenue to 50 million and maybe even more. And they have, anywhere between 10 or 20 or 50, 75 employees. And they have, thousands or tens of thousands of subscribers to their email list. They might be in a Walmart or a CVS. They might just be direct to consumer. And so and let's just say they're 4, 5, 6, or 7 years old. So they definitely have some momentum and maybe a few rounds of investment,
Okay.
and they're doing well. But to your point, they're still not confident that this whole thing is actually working. And by that I mean their own value proposition, their core value proposition, not not like a discount that they're offering on a landing
Hmm.
page or a social media campaign. The whole benefit that they're providing to shoppers, they're not totally confident that it's working as designed, or it could be working as well as it could be working. So in those moments, it is a kind of a combination of the science and just kind of guessing.
Mm.
And the science tends to be a little more expensive, as I mentioned earlier. That route tends to go through an agency partner or a research partner. It tends to involve doing some sort of segmentation. It could be a survey. It could involve using a platform like Mintel or scraping social media feeds. So there's quite a bit of data that's used to inform a variety of decisions, whether it's consumer segmentation or testing some copy. But it's like it's time consuming. It's a bit expensive, and so more times than not, you're kind of, if you're in the situation, you lean towards just picking something and move on. You just don't have
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and it just might not even be worth it. So as I mentioned earlier, I think there's room in the middle, but that my gut, and as I think about the clients I've worked with, there is for sure a preference to be as informed as possible with
Hmm.
data, and there's for sure a preference to be as scientific as possible. But that's just we don't live in an ideal world with infinite money, so a lot of times, these founders bump up against reality and just have to kind of pick something.
Well, I think it's interesting too when you're talking about survey. Wasn't it Henry Ford that has that famous quote? If you ask customers what they wanted, they would want a faster horse and buggy or something to that effect. So when you're designing a survey, when you ask customers their preferences and what they want, how do you know that you're getting information that is actually what they would really take action on versus, just something that they may answer a certain way on a survey, but doesn't really move the needle? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me just start by defending the survey,
Mm.
and because it kind of gets a bad reputation because of the Henry Ford quote, and Steve Jobs kind of famously poo-pooed
Right.
asking people questions. But
And
the
he didn't
reality
like
is,
focus groups, did he?
yeah, the reality is we really wouldn't be where we are in society without survey-based research. My favorite example goes back to the late 19th century. There's a guy named Charles Booth who went door to door in London collecting people's annual income rates.
Mm.
And this was unimaginably painstaking work. He spent years, almost a decade doing this. But the end result were these really detailed income maps
Mhm.
that were in turn used to persuade Parliament to pass the first welfare acts
Oh, nice.
in the Western Hemisphere. So the whole insight there is, there'd been censuses before. There had certainly been collecting data on populations before him, but he was the first one to really use surveys to enact change at the legislation, enact legislation that really kind of changed
Yeah.
a society. So the point was, you can't make progress until you measure the current state of affairs. And you can tell the same story when it comes to education, enrollment levels, health, um, and so on and so on. So without the survey, we wouldn't be able to measure anything. And when you can't measure anything, you cannot pass any laws or make any real changes. So
Mm,
there's a decent argument that the survey is the most important innovation of the 20th century,
mm,
or at least you could make a solid case. Now, when it comes to market research surveys, which came a little bit later in the 20s and 30s, especially during the Depression, when people like George Gallup became famous for predicting the
mhm.
1936 election, and just the cost cutting. The times that era just called for cost cutting wherever necessary. So the survey became a really useful tool to, and the corresponding statistics became like a really useful tool for businesses, especially the ones that were becoming bigger and bigger and more kind of out of touch
Yep.
just by sheer size. So that's kind of my disclaimer and defense of this tool that now seems so dated in an era of AI and scraping of social media feeds and text analytics. It still is absolutely essential. Now let me answer your question about okay, it's a great tool and all that, but does it really help a business anticipate future needs and as opposed to just measuring the current state of affairs? And my one thing to keep in mind here, and this is almost personally frustrating for me, is that the market research survey industry is heavily influenced by statistics for good reasons, and therefore tends to employ people with a background in stats and who are quantitative. So it like the whole thing is overrun by stats majors essentially.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, it's which is a bit of a problem, because when it comes to asking really smart questions, you don't want to be only thinking about how to ask the most neutral question and how to
Mhm.
crunch the data the fastest. And I mean, there's such a premium on getting the mechanics of the survey right. Do you say forbid versus not allow, um, and all the things that you need to keep in mind to make sure your question isn't like systematically biasing the whole uh, sample. So that stuff's really important. But as like I like to say, it's like, imagine if all the visual art, all the painting you've ever seen in your entire life is of the talent level of like a local art gallery show,
Mm,
um, like in a medium or small size city. And like literally your entire life, every painting you ever seen was in like kind of a crappy gallery, and it was like kind of okay. And that's what you thought. Um, that's like, it's like, what do you think of visual art? It's like, okay, it's not that great.
right.
Um, so and then you like go to the Met or any museum in Paris or France. You're like, holy smokes, this is like insane.
Right.
I was thinking about this all wrong. Like, it's not the tools, like the paintbrushes and the paints and the canvas. It's the artist. That's what matters, and what they do with the tools. So I think the same thing is true in the survey world. Namely, you should hire people that can ask really smart questions, who happen to have
Mm,
good understanding of the toolkit, and yeah, they know about the right phrases to use and doing the analytics wisely and all of that. But at the end of the day, it's you probably want someone that knows how to generate the most value per respondent, and that requires kind of more the creativity or humanity of maybe someone from the humanities and not a more quantitative field. So that's kind of maybe a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's very important, because I get this a lot. Like, oh,
yeah.
surveys, aren't those really old and kind of stupid? Well, it's like, okay, no, they're really essential. And remember, it's not the tool; it's the person using the tool. That's the important part.
Well, I think that
Now,
makes sense, but I guess where I was going with that a little bit is, sometimes I'm driving down the road and I pass a neon green car. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so somewhere along the line, somebody did probably a focus group, a survey to say, do you think neon green is a cool color? And somebody or enough people probably answered, yeah, we think it's a cool color. And somewhere along the line, that got translated into, okay, people will buy neon green cars if we make them. And then I wonder, I only see like one neon green car for every 1,000 cars that I pass. So clearly it didn't, take the world by storm. So was that just a case of, oh, we're going to do something different, we're just going to have something out there? Or was it a case of bad market research where somebody thought that because people like neon green tennis shoes, that translates into neon green cars? Do you get what I'm asking here? Is it when you ask a question, do you think this is cool? That's not the same question as would you buy it?
So all the more reason to be really mindful of the question you ask and how you interpret it. I mean, I definitely think that Ford and Jobs had a point with respect to asking people about something that doesn't exist and asking them in a really bad way. Of course, you shouldn't. I mean, think about if you're one of the first few employees at Uber and you do a survey and you ask people, so let's say this is like 2005, back when, the idea of buying something on the internet was becoming more familiar, but certainly not to the degree of buying cars or furniture or any kind of large ticket item. So you're back in 2005 and you ask people, would you use the internet to call a cab? It's like everyone's going to say no. So it's like, what's the problem there? Is it the idea or the bad articulation of the idea? It's probably the bad articulation of the idea. So I love this space because this is where measuring and messaging kind of become the same thing. So let's say you go, it's just like, okay, let's try that survey again. But this time, let's say, would you be interested in using an app-based service to call a cab on demand? Okay, so maybe a few more people say yes.
Okay.
And then you keep pushing that. Would you be interested in using an app-based service to call a cab on demand from a network of cabs in your city? And on the app, you can see how much time it will take the driver to get there. And there's a map. Okay, so you can see what's happening here is in the act of improving the measurement, you're actually improving the messaging, or it's just like you're actually getting better at describing not just the product, but the value proposition to the point where hopefully you'll get a lot more people saying yes, like, where do I sign up? So
you're kind of painting a vision at the same time that you're asking the questions, and you can see what parts of the vision people are actually responding to and which ones they're not.
Yeah, exactly. So this is again, I'm just kind of nodding to the role of asking smart questions and the surveyor versus the tool itself. And you can see how this could go wrong. To your point about the neon car, it's like you could ask a question like the ones that you mentioned. Would you find a neon car cool? You might say a lot of people say yes. Would you actually buy it? Was probably the question that you would want to ask in that case. But really, if we want to stick in automotive, you would want to and maybe if you're a company like Tesla a few years ago, the thing you really want to know is what combination of words will elicit the most compelling response, and that could help us actually sell something. Now, again, there's definitely room for kind of the smaller items like type of color that you like, and do you want internet radio and those things. But I always kind of see those secondary to the core message, and really, as I said, using the measurement process to refine the messaging process.
I could see that, just kind of sticking with the car example for a second and your comment on Tesla. I could see asking a question like, would you be interested in an electric car? And probably there are a great number of people that would answer yes to that. But then if you said, would you be interested in an electric car that has a range of 200 miles? That would probably significantly change the answer to that question, right? Once you give that additional detail about what it technically means to own an electric car, maybe some of its limitations, um, that changes the dynamics of that question considerably.
Yeah, and I'm really inspired by the early 20th century sales letter guys, these people that way before Amazon, way before Walmart, in the early days of Sears, had to write page-long appeals, uh, put them in magazines and newspapers and in the mail, direct to consumer. And this person, and now it's like 1905 or whatever, and you're living 50 miles or 100 miles outside of Chicago on a farm, and you open this letter, and you're going to spend a minute reading this, whether it's for soap or, excuse me, whatever consumer
Yep.
packaged good. The guys that wrote these letters got insanely good at getting people in that moment to pull out their checkbook, or some cash, write in their address, mail their address and the money, and kind of hope that 3 weeks later this thing would show up in the mail. So there's a lot of wisdom and marketing insight that you can learn by reading people that got really good at this. And one of the insights is that, which you just mentioned, a good example is when you can be specific. So your line about that can go 200 miles is great. Claude Hopkins has a few that I like. One is don't say a quick shave, say shave in under 78 seconds. Or don't say used the world over, say used by people in 52 nations. And so anytime you can, being specific can be really helpful. Now, and it's like, okay, everyone in marketing knows that, duh, right? But I find that interesting from the market researcher point of view, because it's exactly your point about Tesla. It's like you would want to hire a researcher, in my humble opinion, that would get ahead of that and say, okay, no, you don't ask people if they want an electric car. What you really want to ask is, do you want an electric car that can go 200 miles? And by the way, let's start thinking about this messaging right now and using some of these tactics, like being specific when we can, because we have this opportunity to refine the messaging in the process of the measuring. So, so for sure, I just have to nod to those old school guys, and again, when I can, be specific in the measurement part.
One of the things that I brought up on this podcast before that puzzles me about some businesses is, just to pick a completely insane example, you'll see somebody advertising, a new shampoo with more vitamin W in it, but they never really say what vitamin W is, what it does, what the benefit of it. It's just got more of it now. And I always wonder, if you're going to sort of rattle off a list of benefits for your product, why would you pick something that is so nebulous in terms of how you're explaining what its true value is? It just has more of it now. And it seems like surveys could be a great way to really better understand what do your customers think the true value of your product is, and then go long on those rather than just picking some ingredient or feature or something of your product that you think is important, but people might not really know what that even is.
Well, first of all, I have to confess that I made this mistake and still make this mistake. Of, talking about your own features versus talking about the benefit to the customers. It's really hard. As I said at the beginning, it's really, since 2020, I've probably spent at least a few minutes every day thinking about what the customer benefit actually is, and wishing that I could see my own service through their eyes, which is about as hard as looking at your sibling and pretending they're a stranger that you've never seen.
You're right.
which is to say that it's impossible unless under extreme neurological conditions. Um, and so I am deeply, and I just appreciate how difficult this position is,
Sure.
and it also makes me. Um, I also think it's just another reason why surveys can be really useful in this case. So what I've done in the past with clients, and this might sound so simple that it sounds stupid, is to use surveys to ask people what they think the benefit is. And that's really, in some cases, the extent of the entire survey I've done. It's an online survey that typically involves me recruiting a sample of respondents from the client's target market, sending them to the client's homepage, or exposing them to any marketing content that they want feedback on, and then asking them a question like, is it 100% clear to you what the benefit of this product or service is? Yes or no? And then an open-ended follow-up. What is it? It's almost kind of scary. It's like, oh Jesus, like they better
Yeah.
get this right. um,
Well, I
Now,
think it's
to your
interesting you ask it as an open-ended question too, and not as is it A, is it B, is it C, but you really let the customer say what they truly believe it is.
yeah, and there's a few um, strategies that I use to kind of speed up the analysis and help the respondent. Specifically, just tell them, like, in a word or short phrase. They probably don't want to write a whole paragraph, and you probably don't need a whole paragraph. And most benefits don't need that much space. So that's kind of the logic behind that question. And I think kind of pound for pound, I've like to think that I've generated the most value from that question for clients, versus any other questions, especially though, like, does this resonate with you? Do you trust this brand? It's like, okay, those I found to be very important for the global brands like Walmart and P&G, whose brand is probably their most important asset, and
Sure.
they're so massive that they are so good at nailing the core fundamentals. Make a product that benefits people and talk about the benefit,
Yep.
like Bounty paper towels absorbs water. It's like they've been saying that for like 50 years.
Yeah.
And Swiffer mops are a convenient cleaning solution. It's like brilliant. Now they won that game so damn well that they're just kind of managing the PR ship. And
Yeah.
so there is room for those kind of broader questions. And yes, to your point about the vitamin D and the other stuff, that stuff seems important to me, but not. But you have to make sure that your customers are hearing it and agreeing with that core benefit first, before you get maybe into the product features. And yeah, in order to do that, I think surveys are just this fantastic old school tool that can help you get 80 or 90% of the way there, without having to drain the marketing budget or the research budget, and waste 6 months and on and on and on. But anyways, that's my own value proposition coming through now.
Well, I like it. And, you've certainly talked about big brands like P&G. Obviously, these folks are experts at what they do, right? This is their core business. They know marketing inside and out. But I think what I find so interesting on this whole topic of surveys is, as a consumer, I'm bombarded with surveys every day. Almost every interaction, if I buy something or whatnot, usually results in a survey. Try to book an airline ticket and then not get a message afterwards. How was the experience? But the surveys are almost always geared toward the customer service experience, which I think is important. But there's rarely any action that follows up those surveys. So if you would say I had a terrible customer service interaction, you really shouldn't expect to get a call the next day from somebody wanting to know more details about that. It just goes into the ether, and you never hear about it again. But what surprises me, as you've sort of laid out this defense of surveys today, is how few brands actually survey me or ask me questions about their brand, about their products. It's almost always about a service experience that resulted from some sort of a problem, or maybe an online purchase or something like that. Do you find the same thing, that surveys have sort of so heavily skewed for many businesses into that customer service interaction, that they're really missing an opportunity to take advantage of, sort of that pre-sale and brand perception?
Yeah, and I would say, remember, a survey is has infinite opportunity. So let me give you two quick examples. When I say infinite opportunity, all I mean is that you can ask any question that you would want in any form. So what are you going to do with that power? I mean, right now I have access, and a lot of people do, to recruiters who in turn have access to something like uh, 20 million Americans and 100 million people around the world. So at any given point, I can spend a few $100s and ask a few hundred people uh, anywhere in the world, or maybe not anywhere, but a lot of places, any question I want.
Mm.
So it's like, whoa, okay, what question are you going to ask? That's like, the technology is cool, and George Gallup would have been unbelievably amazed and called us all spoiled and hated maybe the current state of affairs with surveys, because it's just like it's become such a commodity that
Yeah.
the premium on great questions has decreased. So it's kind of challenging. So like, what are you going to do? And in the case of like a Delta asking about your post-flight experience, okay, it's a little narrower now. Your customer base is just Delta flyers, but that's still, I mean, the analytics manager is probably sitting on a subscriber list of millions, and now they have to decide what to actually do. And so it's kind of a hard situation now. Okay, so going back to the two examples of what you can do, there's a good, I don't know if they still do it, but Trunk Club
Mm.
is, if you go to their homepage, that they start out, that the above the fold section starts out with this question that I think is something like, "What are you looking for?"
Mm.
And there's these three big blocks. This is all very image heavy. It's very well designed, and it says something like casual wear, business wear, and formal wear,
Okay.
or something like that. And you click on one of the options, casual wear, and next you get asked a question about style. I think I'm just relying on memory here, and it shows you a few images that bring to life a few different styles. One might be kind of khaki and tan, one
Hmm.
might be denim, and so on. Anyways, this goes on and on for a few more kind of iterations, and it gets to your sizes and height and all this stuff. And by the end of it, it has a really good recommendation for you. It's like, okay, it's as if you were in the store
Yep.
and a non-annoying salesperson saw that you were interested but not committed and a little uncertain, and just asked you the exact right questions to get you your best option. Anyways, that's a survey.
Mm.
Uh, it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah.
It's very well designed, but that's a survey. It's a survey with great copy that's extremely customer centric. And again, it's blurring the line between measuring and messaging. It's measuring in the sense that every one of those clicks helps Trunk Club.
Sure.
Uh, and then it's messaging in the sense that it's saying, hey, our number one priority is to get you something that you really like.
Yeah.
So it's like, that's a survey, and the post Delta flight, they're both surveys, but obviously they have different uses. And I think personally, one's kind of cooler than the other. The other example that comes to mind is there's this guy back in the 1930s named Henry Weaver, and he worked in the research department at General Motors, and he is kind of credited with the first guy that built what you might call a subscription list,
Okay.
and used it to get customer feedback. Again, before this point, academics had used surveys and social scientists had used surveys, but the industry didn't really pick up on it until the 30s. And anyways, he has this cool article about how he also, drawing on those legendary sales letter guys, didn't send out a questionnaire through the mail requesting for feedback. He invited motor enthusiasts to pool their experience with General Motors mechanics,
Oh, okay.
and saw a huge increase in returns and completion rates when he framed it that way. So it's like a great insight that you want to make sure that you're thinking about the customer, or in this case, the respondent of the survey, in terms of what would benefit them.
Yeah.
This is like the request for feedback is like, okay, what's in this for me? Okay, maybe I'm like helping the brand, and the next time I fly, it's like they're going to make adjustments, but okay, there's probably going to get tons of respondents. I don't have to do this. But when you're invited to pool your experience with General Motors mechanics, and you can imagine back in the 1930s, that may have meant something different. It's kind of exciting. It's like, wow, I'm like,
Yes.
I'm special, and I have an in, and finally someone gets that I have a unique tastes and preferences and so on. So those two examples and all that is just to say that, the questions that you ask and the format of the survey are kind of limitless, and they should always be grounded in what's in it for the respondent question.
I like that because I do feel a lot of questions that we see on surveys. It's almost if you're helping somebody complete their performance review because they're really focused on, the agent, not you as a customer at all. And I think businesses would be wise to get away from all that. I think you've given a strong defense of surveys today. And, as we come to the end of the podcast here, if a business is looking at this or listening to this today and really would like to, get involved, do some more surveys to help their brand and their messaging, how would they get in touch with you and learn more about this whole process?
Well, the personal website is probably the best channel, just sammcnerney.com. And hopefully my own positioning and my own value proposition is customer centric and aligns with some of the thinking that we've just talked about. But I know it's always a huge work in progress, and it's never perfect. LinkedIn is also helpful, and just reaching out via email. So those are the main channels, and I would be happy to answer, at the very least, just answer any questions about using surveys to test messaging. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit that's I'm happy to advise on, just even the boring stuff, like getting a good rate for the respondent fees, what recruiters to work for, what survey platforms to use. That stuff I'm happy to help out with at the very least. But the website's probably the best channel.
That sounds good. I'll make sure that we have all that linked up in the show notes so that people can find you. Sam, I think this has been fascinating. Like I said, we haven't really talked about surveys on this show before, but it's so important to get your messaging right. And if you can use these very powerful tools to better understand your customers and articulate that value proposition better, I think it's money well spent. So hopefully people will reach out and you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions and engage in some conversations. Thanks so much for being on the podcast today. I've really enjoyed this.
Eric, it was a pleasure. I feel spoiled. You've given me a platform to defend the 100-year-old research tool, and I'm grateful for that.
I think George Gallup would be proud of your efforts today.
I hope so. Also, we didn't get to this, but he worked very closely with David Ogilvy and really kind of cut his teeth in the ad industry. And that collaboration has also been inspiring to me. And maybe we can talk about that the next time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is fascinating stuff, and there's certainly more that we could go into. But thank you again for your time today. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Cheers. Likewise.